Dr. Vanessa Hartwell sat in the climate-controlled archives of the Mississippi Department of Archives and History on a February morning in 2024, surrounded by documents that made no sense. She was 59 years old, a retired Marine Corps intelligence analyst who'd served in both Iraq wars before dedicating her retirement to genealogical research. For the past 3 years, she'd been tracing her family history back through slavery, and she'd hit a mystery that no historian could explain, /par. /par. Her great-great-great-grandmother had been a woman named Silence. Just that /F1 /M-Silence. No last name recorded, no indication of where she came from, no birth date. But what made Silence truly unusual was what the records showed. Between 1847 and 1852, she'd been sold at auction 23 times in 5 years. 23 different owners in Mississippi and Louisiana, each one selling her within days /M- sometimes within a single night /M- of purchasing her, /par. /par. The auction records used the same phrases over and over: cannot be kept. Unsuitable for any work. Must be sold immediately. No master will keep her past one night. /par. /par. Vanessa had shown these records to multiple historians. All of them said the same thing: probably mentally ill or violently unstable. Some enslaved people were sold repeatedly when they were too difficult to manage. /par. /par. But that explanation didn't fit the evidence. If Silence had been violent or unstable, the auction records would have documented that to protect sellers from liability. Instead, the records were vague, almost deliberately obscure. And most telling, despite being sold 23 times, Silence's price never dropped below $800 /M-, a substantial sum that suggested she was healthy, skilled, and valuable, /par. /par. Something else was happening. Something the records were hiding, /par. /par. Vanessa's grandmother had told stories before she died /M- stories about Silence who couldn't be kept, who moved from plantation to plantation like a ghost, who made masters afraid though she never raised her hand in violence. The family said Silence had a secret, something she knew or something about her that made white people unable to keep her, /par. /par. Most historians dismissed these stories as embellishment. But Vanessa had learned something in marine intelligence: when records are deliberately vague, when documentation avoids specifics, when multiple sources show the same unusual pattern /M- someone is hiding something, /par. /par. Vanessa pulled another box of records, this one containing letters from plantation owners in Mississippi from the 1840s. She was looking for any mention of a slave named Silence who'd been difficult to keep, /par. /par. 3 hours into her search, she found it. A letter dated September 1848 from a planter named William Crawford to his brother in Louisiana, /par. /par. Dear brother, /par. /par. You asked about the slave I purchased at auction last month /M- the woman called Silence. I must tell you of the most disturbing experience. I bought her for $850, believing her to be a valuable acquisition. She is healthy, appears intelligent, and shows no signs of defiance or madness, /par. /par. But brother, I could not keep her past the first night. Not because she was violent or disobedient /M- quite the opposite. She was docile, obedient, and silent as her name suggests. But there is something about her that is deeply unsettling in a way I cannot explain, /par. /par. That night, after she was placed in the servants' quarters, my wife heard her singing. Not singing, exactly /M- a sound that was something between singing and speaking, in a language neither of us recognized. My wife became hysterical, claiming the sound made her feel ill, that there was something wrong with the woman, /par. /par. I went to investigate. When I approached Silence's quarters, I heard it too. And brother, I cannot describe to you the feeling it produced. Not fear exactly, but a profound discomfort, a sense that something was terribly wrong, though I could not identify what /par. /par. I sold her the next morning to the first buyer I could find, taking a loss on the sale just to be rid of her. The buyer looked at me strangely when I was so eager to sell a seemingly valuable slave so quickly. I could not explain my urgency without seeming mad /par. /par. Brother, I am not a superstitious man. I do not believe in conjuring or witchcraft. But there is something about that woman that no Christian should have to endure under their roof. I am glad to be rid of her /par. /par. William /par. /par. Vanessa read the letter 3 times, her mind racing. This was at /m- the first concrete description of why silence couldn't be kept. Not because she was violent or unstable, but because of something she did at night. Something that made people unable to bear her presence /par. /par. She searched through more documents and found similar letters /par. /par. From plantation owner James Whitmore, October 1849 /par. Purchased the slave called Silence. She lasted one night before my household became unbearable. The sounds she makes /m- I cannot describe them as either human or animal. My wife refuses to stay in the house while that woman is on the property. Selling her immediately. /par. /par. From plantation owner Richard Sutton, March 1850 /par. The slave Silence has some quality that makes her impossible to keep. She is obedient and works well, but at night there is something that happens /m- My children woke screaming, my wife became ill, even the other slaves asked that she be removed. I do not understand it, but I cannot keep her. /par. /par. Vanessa found 18 letters describing similar experiences. Every owner said the same thing: Silence was obedient, capable, and valuable during the day. But at night, something happened that made her impossible to keep. Something involving sounds she made. Something that caused intense discomfort or even illness in people who heard it /par. /par. But none of the letters explained what was actually happening or why it had such a powerful effect /par. /par. Vanessa needed more information. She needed to understand what Silence was doing and why it made people unable to keep her. She expanded her search to include medical records, church records, and testimony from enslaved people interviewed after the Civil War /par. /par. She found the breakthrough in the WPA's slave narratives /m- testimony collected in the 1930s from formerly enslaved people. A woman named Martha, who'd been enslaved in Mississippi in the 1850s, had been interviewed when she was 93 years old. And Martha had known Silence /par. /par. Testimony of Martha Johnson, aged 93, formerly enslaved in Mississippi /par. /par. I knew a woman named Silence. Strange woman. She didn't talk much during the day, just did her work quiet-like. But at night, she would sing. Or maybe it wasn't singing /m- it was something else. A sound that came from deep inside her, in words none of us could understand /par. /par. The white folks couldn't stand it. Every master who bought her would sell her again after one night. They said it made them sick, made them scared, made them feel like something evil was in their house. But it wasn't evil. It was grief /par. /par. You see, Silence had children. 7 children, all of them sold away from her, one by one. Every time a child was born, the master would let her keep it for a few months, then sell it away. 7 times this happened. 7 children torn from her arms /par. /par. After the 7th child was sold, Silence stopped talking during the day. Just stopped. Wouldn't say a word to anyone. But at night, she would make this sound /m- this crying singing mourning sound that wasn't quite human because human grief can't hold all that pain, /par. /par. She was singing the names of her lost children. She was calling to them in a language older than English, a language from Africa that her grandmother had taught her. She was mourning them in the way her people had mourned for hundreds of years, /par. /par. And the white folks couldn't stand to hear it. Couldn't stand to be confronted with what they'd done. Couldn't stand to hear a mother's grief for the children stolen from her. So they sold her away, over and over, trying to get rid of the sound of their own guilt, /par. /par. But silence kept singing. At every plantation, every night, she would sing for her lost children. And every master would sell her away because they couldn't bear to hear the truth of what slavery was doing to families, /par. /par. She never raised her hand in violence. Never disobeyed. Never caused any trouble during the day. But her night singing was more powerful than any rebellion because it forced them to face what they were doing. And they couldn't stand it. /par. /par. Vanessa sat back, tears streaming down her face. This was the secret. Silence wasn't unstable or dangerous. She was a mother mourning 7 lost children in the only way she could /m- by singing their names at night in a language and style that confronted slaveholders with the grief and horror they were causing, /par. /par. And slaveholders couldn't bear to keep her because her mourning made them face the reality of their own cruelty, /par. /par. But Vanessa needed more evidence. She needed to verify Martha's testimony and understand more about Silence's life and what eventually happened to her, /par. /par. She searched medical records and found something that confirmed Martha's account. A doctor in Natchez, Mississippi had written a medical journal article in 1851 about a peculiar case of hysteria in multiple plantation households, /par. /par. I have been consulted by 4 different plantation families in the past year regarding a curious phenomenon. Each family reports experiencing severe distress, insomnia, anxiety, and in some cases physical illness, all precipitated by the presence of a particular slave woman on their property, /par. /par. The woman in question is called Silence and appears to be entirely healthy and shows no signs of mental derangement or infectious disease. However, each family reports that at night, she produces vocalizations that cause intense psychological distress in anyone who hears them, /par. /par. I examined the woman myself after the 4th complaint. She is approximately 35 years old, appears to be of sound body and mind, and shows no signs of illness. When questioned about her nighttime vocalizations, she remained silent and would not respond, /par. /par. However, I observed her for one evening and heard the sounds in question. I can only describe them as a form of lamentation or mourning chant, performed in what appears to be an African language. The sounds are not loud or threatening, but they produce an effect that I can only describe as profoundly disturbing /m- not due to any supernatural quality, but because they confront the listener with emotions that are difficult to bear, /par. /par. My medical opinion is that this woman has experienced severe trauma /m- likely the loss of children, which is common among slave women whose offspring are sold away. Her nightly vocalizations are a manifestation of unresolved grief. They are psychologically disturbing to listeners not because of any inherent danger, but because they force confrontation with the suffering that slavery inflicts on mothers and families, /par. /par. I have advised plantation owners that the woman poses no physical threat and is capable of work. However, I understand their reluctance to keep her, as the psychological effects on the household are real and distressing. The woman appears to be unsuitable for long-term placement in any single household due to the distress her mourning causes, /par. /par. Dr. Samuel Harrison, Natchez, Mississippi, 1851 /par. /par. Vanessa had found it /m professional medical documentation confirming that Silence was mourning lost children and that her mourning was so powerful, so confrontational, that slaveholders couldn't bear to keep her /par. But Vanessa still had questions. What happened to Silence after 1852? Did she ever find any of her children? And most importantly /m was Silence Vanessa's direct ancestor, or was she related to Vanessa's family in some other way, /par. Vanessa spent the next 3 months tracking every scrap of evidence about Silence. She found the names of all 23 people who'd purchased her between 1847 and 1852. She found auction records showing she'd been sold in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama. She found letters from owners trying to warn other potential buyers about the problem with Silence, though most were vague about what the problem actually was, /par. And then she found something that changed everything, a letter from 1853, written by a woman named Elizabeth Garrett, a Quaker abolitionist in Pennsylvania, to a colleague in Boston, /par. Dear friend, /par. I write to tell thee of a remarkable woman who has recently arrived here via the Underground Railroad. Her name is Silence /m she will say no other name, and we have not pressed her. She escaped from a plantation in Alabama 3 months ago and made her way north through extraordinary courage and determination, /par. Silence does not speak during the day, but at night she sings. It is the most haunting sound I have ever heard /m a lamentation in an African language, calling the names of 7 children who were sold away from her. Each night, she sings for hours, and though the sound is sorrowful beyond description, it is also beautiful in its way. It is the sound of a mother's love that slavery could not destroy, /par. We have been searching for her children. Through our networks, we have found records of 5 of them /m scattered across the South, enslaved on different plantations. We are working to purchase their freedom or help them escape. Silence says she will continue singing every night until all 7 are found. She says it is the only way she can stay connected to them /m by speaking their names in the language of her ancestors, /par. She is the most courageous woman I have ever met. For 6 years, she was sold from plantation to plantation because her grief made slaveholders uncomfortable. But she never stopped grieving. She never let them silence her mourning. And now she is free, and she will find her children, /par. Thee should know, dear friend, that Silence's story shows something important. Enslaved people have ways of resisting that we may not always recognize. Silence never raised her hand in violence, but her mourning was an act of resistance. It forced slaveholders to confront the horror of what they were doing. It made them so uncomfortable they couldn't keep her. And that discomfort /m that inability to bear witness to the grief they were causing /m is itself a form of power, /par. Elizabeth Garrett, Philadelphia, 1853 /par. Vanessa felt relief flooding through her. Silence had escaped. She'd made it to freedom. And abolitionists had been helping her search for her children, /par. But had she found them? Vanessa needed to know what happened next, /par. She contacted historical societies in Philadelphia and found more records. Elizabeth Garrett's personal papers included letters describing Silence's story over the next several years, /par. In 1854, 2 of Silence's children /m both daughters /m were purchased by abolitionists and brought to Philadelphia. The reunion was documented in a letter, /par. The reunion between Silence and her daughters was the most moving thing I have witnessed. Silence sang their names /m Adana and Kayamaka /m and when they heard her voice, both girls began to weep. They had been only 4 and 6 years old when sold away and had not heard their mother's voice in 10 years. But they remembered. They remembered her singing. /par. /par. Between 1854 and 1860, for more of Silence's children were located and freed /m-3 sons and 1 daughter. Only 1 child remained lost /m-a son who'd been sold to a plantation in Texas and couldn't be located /par. /par. Silence continued her nightly singing, but now she sang with her children present. The singing gradually changed from pure mourning to something that included joy and remembrance. But she continued to sing for the lost 7th child every night, calling his name /m-chitty /m- hoping somehow he would hear her voice and know she was still searching /par. /par. Then Vanessa found something that made her start crying in the middle of the archives. A letter dated 1865, written by Silence herself /m- the first time the historical record showed her written words /par. /par. My name is Silence no more. I was called that because I stopped speaking after my 7th child was taken. But now I speak again. I am Kayamika, daughter of Adiz, granddaughter of Amara. I am the keeper of names. I am the singer of grief. I am the mother who never stopped searching /par. /par. 6 of my 7 children are with me now. We live in Philadelphia. We are free. But I sing still for Chitty, my lost son. I sing his name every night in the language my grandmother taught me. I sing so he will know I did not forget him. I sing so the names of my ancestors will not be lost. I sing because my voice is my resistance /par. /par. For 6 years, I was sold from plantation to plantation because white people could not bear to hear my grief. They called me Silence, but my mourning was the loudest thing they ever heard. It made them so uncomfortable they had to send me away. And every time they sold me, they thought they were getting rid of a problem. But they were spreading the truth of what slavery was doing to families. They were spreading the sound of a mother's grief that could not be silenced /par. /par. Now I am free, and I sing still. But I sing with 5 of my children beside me. I sing in a house where no one can sell me away. I sing in a voice that slavery tried to silence but never could /par. /par. This is my resistance, I survive. I remember. I speak the names. And I never stopped being a mother, even when they tried to take my children and my voice /par. /par. My name is Kayamika. It means, God is beautiful. I sing to remind myself and my children that even in the darkest times, there is beauty in love, in memory, in the refusal to be silenced /par. /par. Kayamika, formerly called Silence /par. Philadelphia, 1865 /par. /par. Vanessa sat in the archives, holding the letter with shaking hands. This was her ancestor /m- not Silence, but Kayamika. The woman who'd been sold 23 times because her grief was too powerful for slaveholders to bear. The woman who'd never stopped mourning her children, who'd turned her grief into resistance, who'd survived and escaped and reunited with 6 of her 7 children /par. /par. And Vanessa needed to know, did Kayamika ever find Chitty, her 7th child? And how was Vanessa related to this extraordinary woman, /par? /par. She searched post-Civil War records and found the answer to the first question in a newspaper article from 1872, /par. /par. Remarkable reunion in Philadelphia /par. /par. Yesterday, a reunion took place in this city that demonstrates the enduring bonds of family despite the evils of slavery. A woman named Kayamika, formerly enslaved and known by the name Silence, was reunited with her 7th child /m- a son named Chitty, now age 32, who had been enslaved in Texas until the end of the war /par. Par. Chitty had been searching for his mother since 1865, having heard stories from other formerly enslaved people about a woman who sang in an African language at night, calling the names of her lost children. He traveled to Philadelphia based on these stories and, upon hearing his mother's voice singing his name, knew he had found her. Par. Par. The reunion was attended by dozens of friends and supporters who had helped in the search. Mrs. Kayamaka, age 59, stated, "For 25 years I sang my children's names. 7 names, every night. Now all 7 are with me, and I can sing with joy instead of only grief." Par. Par. This family's story serves as a reminder of the cruelties of slavery, which separated families, and the resilience of love, which brought them back together. Par. Par. Vanessa felt overwhelming emotion. Kayamaka had found all 7 of her children. After 25 years of searching and singing, she'd reunited with every one of them. Par. Par. But Vanessa still needed to determine how she was related to Kayamaka. She compared DNA results with genealogical records and found the connection. Vanessa was descended from Adana, one of Kayamaka's daughters. The first child who'd been sold away when she was only 4 years old. Par. Par. Vanessa's great-great-great-grandmother was Adana, daughter of Kayamaka. Which meant Kayamaka was Vanessa's great-great-great-great-grandmother. Par. Par. The woman who'd been sold 23 times, who'd mourned so powerfully that slaveholders couldn't bear to keep her, who'd never stopped singing her children's names. That was Vanessa's direct ancestor. Par. Par. Vanessa knew this story needed to be told. But as she prepared to publish her research, she received a phone call that made her realize the story was more complicated and more relevant to the present than she'd imagined. Par. Par. Dr. Hartwell. My name is Professor Michael Torres. I'm a musicologist at Howard University, specializing in African musical traditions preserved during slavery. I heard you've been researching a woman called Silence who was repeatedly sold because of her nighttime singing. I need to talk to you about what she was actually doing. Because it wasn't just mourning. It was something much more sophisticated and much more threatening to slaveholders than they realized. Par. 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 Dr. Michael Torres arrived at Vanessa's home in Jackson, Mississippi the following week, carrying a leather satchel filled with research materials. He was in his early 40s, with intense eyes and a kind of energy that came from someone who'd uncovered something important and couldn't wait to share it. Par. Par. Dr. Hartwell, thank you for meeting with me. What I'm about to tell you will completely change how you understand Kayamaka the woman called Silence. Par. Par. They sat in Vanessa's study, surrounded by copies of the documents she'd found. Michael spread out his own materials recordings, transcriptions, and ethnomusicological analyses. Par. Par. You found letters describing Kayamaka's nightly singing as lamentation or mourning, Michael began. And that's partially true. But it was also something else something that slaveholders couldn't fully understand because they didn't know the African musical traditions she was using. Par. Par. Kayamaka was using a specific form of communication called talking singing from West African traditions probably Igbo, based on the names you found. It's a sophisticated form of tonal language combined with music that can convey complex information across distances. She wasn't just mourning. She was communicating. Par. Par. Vanessa felt her breath catch. Communicating what? And to whom? Par. Par. To her children, wherever they were. To other enslaved people on surrounding plantations. To anyone who knew how to listen. Michael pulled out a document. I've been researching this form of communication for 15 years. And when I heard about a woman who was sold repeatedly because of her nighttime singing, I knew immediately what she was doing, /par. /par. Look at this testimony from an enslaved man named Joseph, recorded in 1937. He was in his 90s, and he remembered hearing singing at night on the plantation where he'd been enslaved in Mississippi in the 1850s, /par. /par. There was a woman who would sing at night. Strange singing, in words we didn't know. But some of the older folks /m- the ones who remembered Africa or whose parents remembered /m- they said she was singing news. She was singing about plantations where masters were cruel, about places where people had escaped, about where children had been sold. She was singing a map and a warning and a memory all at once. The white folks thought she was just grieving, but she was teaching us. She was keeping us connected. /par. /par. Vanessa stared at the testimony. Are you saying Kayamika was running an information network through her singing? /par. /par. I'm saying she was using her voice as a weapon, Michael said. Slaveholders couldn't stand to hear her because on a subconscious level, they understood she was doing something powerful /m- something that threatened their control. They just didn't know exactly what /par. /par. Think about it, she was sold 23 times in 5 years, which meant she was present on 23 different plantations across Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama. Every place she went, she gathered information /m- which masters were cruel, where children had been sold, which routes were used for transporting slaves, where the weak points in security were, /par. /par. And every night, she sang that information in a form that other enslaved people could understand but white people just heard as mourning. She was building a communication network that connected enslaved people across multiple plantations and states. /par. /par. Michael pulled out a map. Look at the plantations where she was sold. They form a geographic network covering hundreds of miles. She was positioned, whether deliberately or by chance, to gather and spread information across a huge area, /par. /par. And here's what's crucial, the Underground Railroad was most active in this region during exactly the period when Kayamika was being sold repeatedly. I believe she was gathering intelligence that was being used to plan escape routes. Her singing wasn't just grief /m- it was strategic intelligence gathering disguised as mourning. /par. /par. Vanessa looked at the map, seeing the pattern Michael had identified. So slaveholders sold her away because her singing made them uncomfortable. But by selling her, they were actually moving her to new locations where she could gather more information. /par. /par. Exactly. They thought they were getting rid of a problem. They were actually facilitating an intelligence network. Every time they sold her, she gained access to new information, new people, new knowledge about the system she was fighting against. /par. /par. Michael paused, then continued, and there's something else. I found testimony suggesting that Kayamika's children /m- or at least some of them /m- were also using this form of communication. Before they were sold away, she taught them the songs. She taught them the language. So even when they were separated, they could potentially communicate across distances using the same technique, /par. /par. That's why she kept singing their names every night. She wasn't just mourning. She was maintaining a connection. She was making sure they didn't forget the language, the songs, the tradition. She was keeping a network alive across hundreds of miles and multiple years of separation. /par. /par. Vanessa felt goosebumps on her arms. Her ancestor hadn't just been a grieving mother, though she was certainly that. She'd been an intelligence operative using African musical traditions to build a communication network under the noses of slaveholders who thought they were just hearing grief, /par. /par. Michael, This changes everything. This means Kayamika's resistance was much more sophisticated than I understood. She wasn't just surviving /m-, she was actively fighting the system. /par. /par. Yes. And the fact that slaveholders couldn't keep her /m-, the bizarre secret that no master could bear for more than one night /m-, that wasn't a weakness. It was her power. Her voice was so threatening, so unsettling, so confrontational that she became impossible to control through the normal mechanisms of slavery. They couldn't beat it out of her. They couldn't silence her. All they could do was move her to someone else's plantation, which just spread her influence further. /par. /par. Over the next weeks, Vanessa and Michael collaborated on expanding the research. They found more testimony from formerly enslaved people who remembered hearing night singing on plantations where Kayamika had been briefly present. They analyzed the geographic pattern of her sales and found it corresponded with known underground railroad routes. They documented connections between Kayamika's presence on a plantation and subsequent escapes from that plantation or neighboring properties, /par. /par. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Kayamika had been using her grief as cover for intelligence gathering and communication. Her mourning had been real /m-, the loss of 7 children was genuine trauma. But she'd channeled that grief into resistance, using African musical traditions to build a network that helped other enslaved people escape while she searched for her own children, /par. /par. But Vanessa and Michael also found something troubling. Descendants of the families who'd owned Kayamika briefly were still prominent in Mississippi and Louisiana. And some of them would not want this story told, /par. /par. Vanessa received her first threatening letter 3 weeks after Michael's visit, /par. /par. Dr. Hartwell, you are researching my family's history without permission. The slave called Silence was my great-great-great-grandfather's property briefly in 1850. Your research suggests he and other plantation owners were uncomfortable with this woman's grief and couldn't bear to keep her, /par. /par. This framing makes my ancestor sound cruel and cowardly. I will not allow my family's reputation to be damaged by your activist interpretation of historical events. If you publish this research, my family will take legal action, /par. /par. I am also aware that you are working with Dr. Torres to suggest this woman was conducting intelligence operations. This is absurd speculation designed to romanticize resistance where none existed. Stop this research or face consequences, /par. /par. Robert Whitmore 3, /par. /par. Vanessa showed the letter to Michael, who'd received a similar threat. They discussed their options and made a decision. They would continue the research and publish it, but they would document everything meticulously and make sure every claim was supported by evidence, /par. /par. They also reached out to other descendants of Kayamika /m- Vanessa's distant cousins, all descended from Kayamika's 7 children. They organized a family reunion in Philadelphia, bringing together over 60 descendants who'd never met but who all shared Kayamika as their ancestor, /par. /par. At the reunion, Vanessa presented the research. She showed the auction records documenting Kayamika's 23 sales. She shared the letters describing slaveholders' inability to keep her. She presented Martha's testimony about Kayamika's 7 lost children. And she introduced Michael's theory about the sophisticated intelligence network Kayamika had been running through her nightly singing, /par. /par. An elderly woman named Grace, who was 91 and descended from Chitty, Kayamika's 7th child, spoke up. My grandfather /m-Chitty /m- told me stories before he died. He said his mother taught him songs when he was very small, before he was sold away. Songs in a language he didn't understand but never forgot. He said when he heard her singing in Philadelphia in 1872, he recognized his own name even though he'd been only 7 years old when they were separated. He said the songs were how she found him /him because she never stopped singing, and the songs carried across the years. /par. /par. Another descendant, a middle-aged man named Jerome descended from Adana, shared, "My family has always said that Adana /him our ancestor who was Kayamika's daughter /him became a teacher after the war. She taught formerly enslaved children to read and write. But she also taught them songs /him old songs in African languages that her mother had taught her. She said the songs were memory. She said they were resistance. She said they were how her mother had kept the family connected even when they were scattered across the South. /par. /par. The family stories supported Michael's theory. Kayamika had taught her children communication through song. She'd maintained that communication across separation. And her descendants had preserved those songs as a form of cultural memory and resistance. /par. /par. Vanessa and Michael decided to publish their findings in a book, The Singing Resistance, Kayamika and the Underground Intelligence Network of the 1850s. They documented everything carefully, including the threats they'd received from descendants of slaveholders. /par. /par. But before publication, they received unexpected support from an unlikely source. A woman named Patricia Whitmore Brooks contacted Vanessa. /par. /par. Dr. Hartwell, I'm Robert Whitmore III's cousin. He sent you that threatening letter without consulting other family members. I want to apologize for his behavior and to offer support for your research. /par. /par. I've read the historical records about Kayamika. And I've read my great-great-great-grandfather's letters describing his inability to keep her after one night. Those letters reveal something important: he was frightened of her. Not because she was violent or threatening, but because her grief confronted him with the reality of what slavery was doing to families. /par. /par. My ancestor wrote, I cannot bear to have that woman in my house. Her mourning is a mirror showing me the cruelty I am complicit in. I must send her away because I cannot face what her grief reveals about my own actions. /par. /par. Dr. Hartwell, that's not something to hide. That's something to acknowledge. My ancestor was complicit in great evil. Kayamika's grief made him uncomfortable because it forced him to see that evil clearly. And rather than change his behavior, he sold her away. /par. /par. That's the truth. And truth matters more than family reputation. /par. /par. I've convinced several other family members to support your research rather than oppose it. We believe our ancestors' complicity should be acknowledged, not hidden. And we believe Kayamika's story /him her grief, her resistance, her courage /him deserves to be told completely. /par. /par. With Patricia's support and the backing of Kayamika's descendants, Vanessa and Michael published their book in 2025. The response was immediate and polarizing. /par. /par. Some historians praised it as groundbreaking research showing sophisticated forms of resistance that had been overlooked. Others criticized it for speculation about Kayamika's intentions and for being too sympathetic to enslaved people's strategies. /par. /par. Some descendants of slaveholders attacked the book, claiming it was defamatory and activist history. Others, like Patricia, embraced it as an opportunity to honestly reckon with their family's role in slavery. /par. /par. But the most meaningful response came from Kayamika's descendants and from other black families who recognized their own ancestors' stories in Kayamika's experience. /par. /par. A woman named Dr. Sharon Mitchell, a professor of African American Studies, wrote a review that captured why the story mattered. /par. /par. For generations, we've been told that enslaved people who were repeatedly sold were problems /him mentally ill, violent, or unstable. This narrative erases the reality that some enslaved people were so threatening to the system / not through violence but through their humanity, their grief, their refusal to be fully controlled / that slaveholders couldn't bear to keep them /par. Kayamika was sold 23 times not because she was a problem but because she was powerful. Her grief was so authentic, so profound, so confrontational that it made slaveholders uncomfortable. Her voice carried truth that they couldn't bear to hear. And her singing / disguised as mourning but actually sophisticated communication / built networks that helped others escape while she searched for her children /par. This is resistance. Not the dramatic, violent resistance of rebellion, but the patient, strategic, sophisticated resistance of a woman who used every tool available to her / her voice, her knowledge of African traditions, her presence on multiple plantations / to fight the system while never giving up the search for her children /par. Kayamika's story should be taught in every history class. Not to romanticize slavery / nothing can make slavery acceptable. But to show that enslaved people were strategic, intelligent, sophisticated in their resistance. That they used cultural knowledge and traditions to fight in ways slaveholders didn't understand. That grief itself could be weaponized when it forced confrontation with the horror of what slavery was doing /par. The bizarre secret that no master could bear to keep after a single night wasn't that Kayamika was defective. It was that she was too powerful. Her voice was too truthful. Her grief was too confrontational. Her humanity was too undeniable /par. And that power terrified them. /par. The book sparked a broader conversation about hidden forms of resistance during slavery. Researchers began investigating other cases of enslaved people who were repeatedly sold, looking for patterns that might reveal strategic resistance rather than just problems. /par. They found dozens of similar cases / people who were sold repeatedly for reasons the records described vaguely, people whose problems seemed to be that they made slaveholders uncomfortable rather than that they were violent or unstable /par. Each case suggested forms of resistance that historians had missed or dismissed / people who used grief, cultural practices, knowledge, or simply their undeniable humanity to confront slaveholders in ways that made them impossible to keep /par. But Vanessa's work on Kayamika had one more revelation to deliver. 6 months after the book was published, she received a package from a woman named Adana Wilson, a distant cousin descended from Kayamika's daughter Adana /par. Inside the package was a journal / written by Adana in the 1890s, when she was in her 50s. The journal had been preserved by her descendants and had never been shared publicly /par. Vanessa opened it with shaking hands and began to read /par. My mother taught me to sing. When I was 4 years old and sold away from her, I carried her songs with me. For 10 years, I heard her voice in my memory, singing my name /Adana and my sister's name /Kayamika and the names of my brothers /par. When I was 14 and reunited with my mother in Philadelphia, she told me the truth about her singing. She said, I was never silent. White people called me silence because I wouldn't speak to them. But I was speaking all the time to you, to your brothers and sisters, to the ancestors, to anyone who knew how to listen. /par. She explained that her night singing was mourning, yes. But it was also teaching. It was passing on knowledge. It was maintaining connections. It was keeping our family alive even when we were scattered across the South /par. She said, every night I sang, I was telling you where I was. I was teaching you the old language. I was making sure you remembered who you were. And I was gathering information about where you might be, about who was being sold and where, about how the system worked so I could find you. /par. /par. She said the white people who sold her over and over thought they were getting rid of a problem. But really, they were moving her around like a chess piece, putting her in position to learn more, to connect more people, to build a network that eventually helped her and many others escape. /par. /par. She said, they thought my grief made me weak. But my grief made me strong. They thought my singing was just mourning. But my singing was strategy. They thought they were in control. But I was fighting them every single night with the only weapons I had /m- my voice, my memory, and my refusal to let them make me truly silent. /par. /par. My mother was the strongest person I ever knew. She survived horrors I cannot fully imagine. She never stopped fighting, never stopped searching, never stopped singing. And she found all 7 of us /m- every single child she'd lost, she found again, /par. /par. That is her legacy. Not just that she survived, but that she fought. Not just that she mourned, but that she transformed her mourning into resistance. Not just that she was called silence, but that she was never truly silent /m- her voice carried across distance and time and separation, connecting her children and helping others find freedom, /par. /par. I write this so her descendants will know, you come from a woman who could not be silenced, could not be controlled, could not be broken. You come from a woman whose grief was so powerful it made oppressors uncomfortable. You come from a woman who used every tool she had /m- her voice, her culture, her love for her children /m- to fight an evil system, /par. /par. Be proud of her. Remember her. And when you face injustice, remember that sometimes the most powerful resistance is the one that makes your oppressors so uncomfortable they can't bear to be in your presence, /par. /par. That is the legacy of Kayamaka, the woman they called silence but who was never silent, /par. /par. Adana, daughter of Kayamaka /par. Philadelphia, 1893 /par. /par. Vanessa published this journal entry as an epilogue to the second edition of her book. And she used it in presentations to explain why Kayamaka's story mattered not just as history but as inspiration, /par. /par. At a symposium in 2026, Vanessa stood before an audience and said, /par. /par. My ancestor Kayamaka was sold 23 times in 5 years because no master could bear to keep her after a single night. For over a century, this was treated as evidence that she was a problem, /m- mentally ill, unstable, impossible to manage, /par. /par. But the truth is that Kayamaka was so powerful, so strategic, so confrontational with her grief and her humanity that slaveholders couldn't control her. They could own her legally, but they couldn't silence her voice. They could sell her, but they couldn't break her spirit. They could separate her from her children, but they couldn't stop her from singing their names and eventually finding them, /par. /par. The bizarre secret that made her impossible to keep wasn't a flaw. It was her strength. Her grief was authentic /m- 7 children stolen from her arms. But she weaponized that grief, using it to gather intelligence, build networks, maintain connections, and ultimately escape to freedom with all 7 children reunited, /par. /par. That's not just survival. That's resistance. Sophisticated, strategic, patient resistance that used cultural knowledge and traditions in ways that slaveholders couldn't understand or control, /par. /par. Kayamaka's story challenges us to reconsider what resistance looks like. Not always dramatic or violent. Sometimes quiet and patient. Sometimes hidden in plain sight, disguised as exactly what oppressors expected /m- grief, mourning, cultural practices they dismissed as primitive, /par. /par. And Kayamika's story reminds us that some people are so powerful in their humanity, so undeniable in their grief, so confrontational with the truth that oppressive systems can't bear to keep them. They have to be moved, silenced, hidden away /m- not because they're dangerous but because they're too truthful /par. /par. That's power. And that's the legacy of the woman they called Silence but who was never, ever silent. /par. /par. The bizarre secret of the silent slave no master could bear to keep after a single night had been revealed. And the truth was more powerful, more strategic, and more inspiring than anyone had imagined /par. /par. Kayamika /m- the woman called Silence /m- had used her voice as a weapon, her grief as resistance, and her love for her children as the motivation that kept her fighting for 25 years until all 7 were found and reunited /par. /par. She'd survived. She'd fought. She'd won /par. /par. And her descendants /m- including Vanessa /m- would make sure her story was never forgotten /par. 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 The publication of Kayamika's story had ripple effects that Vanessa hadn't anticipated. Within 6 months, 3 other historians contacted her with similar cases they'd uncovered /m- enslaved people who were repeatedly sold for mysterious reasons that historical records described vaguely but that suggested strategic resistance rather than instability /par. /par. But the most significant contact came from an unexpected source, a woman named Dr. Aisha Okonkwo, a linguist from Nigeria who specialized in Igbo language and traditions /par. /par. Dr. Hartwell, I read your book about Kayamika. I need to tell you something about the songs she was singing. I believe I can translate them. And if I'm right, they contain specific, detailed intelligence about the Underground Railroad that has never been documented. /par. /par. Dr. Okonkwo flew to Mississippi to meet with Vanessa and Michael Torres. She brought recordings of traditional Igbo mourning songs and communication patterns that had been preserved in Nigeria for centuries /par. /par. The names Kayamika used for herself and her children /m- Kayamika, Adana, Chidi, these are Igbo names, Dr. Okonkwo explained. And the talking singing your research describes is a specific Igbo tradition called Ekwe /f2 lang 1066 U7909, Demiri f1 literally, voice of the water, because it could carry across rivers and distances /par. /par. This tradition uses tonal patterns in the Igbo language combined with melody to create messages that sound like singing but actually convey specific information. It was used in West Africa for centuries to communicate news, warnings, and complex information across villages /par. /par. The genius of using it during slavery was that to English speakers, it sounded like random vocalizations or emotional mourning. They couldn't decode it because they didn't know the tonal language or the melodic patterns. But to anyone who knew Igbo traditions /m- even people who'd been born in America but whose parents or grandparents had taught them /m- the songs carried clear messages. /par. /par. Dr. Okonkwo showed them transcriptions of traditional Igbo communication songs. Look at the structure. Each phrase contains information about location, direction, safety, danger. The songs are literally maps and warnings encoded in music. /par. /par. She pulled out a recording. This is a modern example of Ekwe /f2 U7909, Demiri, recorded in Nigeria in 2010. Listen to how it sounds like singing, but the tones and patterns actually spell out a message: the river is flooded. Take the eastern path. Wait 3 days before crossing. /par. /par. Vanessa listened, hearing the melodic, haunting quality that reminded her of descriptions of Kayamika's singing. So when Kayamika sang at night, she wasn't just calling her children's names. She was sending detailed messages. /par. /par. I believe so. And if we can find any recorded or transcribed versions of her songs, I might be able to translate them and recover actual intelligence about Underground Railroad operations from the 1850s. /par. /par. They began a painstaking search through historical records. Most descriptions of Kayamika's singing were vague /f1 / haunting, disturbing, in an unknown language. But they found 3 sources that included more detail /par. /par. First, a letter from 1850 written by a plantation overseer named Samuel Brooks who'd heard Kayamika's singing and had tried to write down what he heard /par. /par. The slave woman Silence sings at night in a tongue none of us know. I attempted to transcribe the sounds for Master's review. The words sound like Adana, Chiamaka, Chidi, Obim, Kayambim, Ifeoma. She repeats these sounds with variations, sometimes rising in pitch, sometimes falling, sometimes holding notes for long duration. Master says it is just the meaningless wailing of a mother for lost children, but I confess it sounds more purposeful than mere grief. /par. /par. Second, testimony from an enslaved man named Thomas, recorded in 1866, /par. /par. I heard that woman Silence singing on the plantation where I worked in 1851. She sang in the African tongue /m- words like Adana and Kayamika, which we understood were names. But she sang other words too, words about directions and places. She sang north and 3 days and river crossing. We knew she was teaching us something, but most of us didn't understand the full message. The older folks, the ones whose parents remembered Africa, they understood more. They would listen to her singing and then tell us things /m- which masters to avoid, where people had escaped to, how long to wait before running. /par. /par. Third, a medical journal entry from Dr. Samuel Harrison, the same doctor who'd examined Kayamika in 1851, /par. /par. I observed the woman's vocalizations for an entire evening. She appears to sing the same phrases repeatedly with minor variations. I recorded what I could hear: Adana Kua, Kayamika Oma, Chidi Beira, Obimkara, Kambili Fe, Amaranato. The phrases are melodic and appear to follow specific tonal patterns. The woman becomes more animated in certain passages, suggesting emphasis or importance. Though I cannot understand the language, I observe that the vocalizations are structured and purposeful rather than random expressions of emotion. /par. /par. Dr. Okonkwo examined these transcriptions with growing excitement. This is it. These are Igbo phrases embedded in communication songs. Let me translate what we have. /par. /par. She worked for several hours, consulting reference materials and playing with tonal patterns. Finally, she presented her findings, /par. /par. Adana Kua means, first daughter, listen. Kayamika Oma means, God is beautiful, remember. Chidi Beira means, God's spirit, come. These are calling the children's names but also embedding meaning /m- listen, remember, come. /par. /par. But then we have Obim Kara /m- my heart, count/measure. Kambili Fe /m- let me stay, good. Amaranado /m- grace takes/receives. /par. /par. These aren't just names. These are instructions. Count/measure /m- could mean count days or measure distance. Let me stay, good /m- instruction to wait, that waiting is safe. Grace takes/receives /m- possibly indicating a person named Grace who helps, or Grace as in a safe place, /par. /par. The testimony from Thomas supports this. He said she sang about north, 3 days, river crossing. Dr. Hartwell, Kayamika wasn't just mourning. She was giving detailed escape instructions embedded in songs about her children. /par. /par. Vanessa felt chills running down her arms. Can you translate the other transcriptions? /par. /par. Dr. Okonkwo spent weeks working through the limited transcriptions they had. What emerged was a partial but clear picture. Kayamika's songs contained encoded information about plantation security, escape routes, timing for safe travel, and locations of helpers, /par. /par. But more than that /m the repetitive nature of the songs, sung every night, created a form of teaching. Enslaved people who heard her night after night would gradually learn the phrases, the tones, the meanings. Even if they didn't speak Igbo, they could learn these specific phrases and potentially use them to communicate with others who'd also heard Kayamika's singing, /par. /par. She was creating a shared code, Michael Torres said, his voice filled with awe. Every plantation where she stayed briefly, she taught this code. People who'd never met each other but who'd both been on plantations where Kayamika had stayed would share this common language. They could potentially recognize each other as safe contacts for escape networks. /par. /par. It's brilliant, Dr. Okonkwo agreed. And it was hidden in plain sight. Slaveholders heard it as mourning. But it was actually sophisticated intelligence communication. /par. /par. Vanessa, Michael, and Dr. Okonkwo published their findings in a second book, The Songs of Kayamika, Decoded Intelligence from the Underground Railroad. The book included Dr. Okonkwo's translations, analysis of how the communication system worked, and arguments for why this represented one of the most sophisticated resistance efforts of the slavery era, /par. /par. The book sparked intense academic debate. Some historians praised it as groundbreaking work revealing previously unknown forms of resistance. Others criticized it as speculation based on limited evidence. /par. /par. But the criticism that hurt most came from an unexpected source. A prominent black historian named Dr. Raymond Johnson wrote a review challenging the entire project, /par. /par. While I appreciate Dr. Hartwell's dedication to honoring her ancestor, I worry that this research romanticizes resistance in ways that may not be helpful. We have limited evidence of what Kayamika's songs actually said or meant. To claim she was running a sophisticated intelligence operation based on a few transcriptions and linguistic analysis is to make her into a superhero rather than acknowledging her as a suffering human being, /par. /par. Kayamika lost 7 children. That trauma was real and devastating. Her grief was authentic. To suggest that her mourning was actually strategic intelligence gathering risks minimizing the genuine pain she experienced. Can't she be both a grieving mother and a resistor? Why must we make her extraordinary when being an ordinary mother who suffered and survived is already worthy of honor? /par. /par. Vanessa read the review several times, feeling its weight. Dr. Johnson had a point. Was she so eager to prove Kayamika was a strategic resistor that she was minimizing the authentic grief she'd experienced, /par. /par. She struggled with this question for weeks, until she received a letter from Grace, the 92-year-old descendant of Chitty, Kayamika's 7th child, /par. /par. Dr. Hartwell, /par. /par. I read Dr. Johnson's review. And I want to tell you something my grandfather Chitty told me before he died, /par. /par. He said when he was reunited with his mother in 1872 /m- when he was 32 and she was 59 /m- he asked her about her singing. He asked if it was true that she'd been using it to help others escape while searching for her children, /par. /par. She told him, my grief was real. Every night I cried for you and your brothers and sisters. I mourned every moment you were gone from me. That was true, /par. /par. And also true, I used my grief as a weapon. I learned that my mourning made white people uncomfortable. I learned that it gave me power they couldn't control. So I sang louder. I sang with more purpose. I taught others through my singing. I gathered information and spread it. I helped others escape while I searched for you, /par. /par. Both things were true. I was a grieving mother. And I was a fighter. My grief didn't make me weak it made me strong. It gave me a reason to survive, a reason to fight, a reason to never stop until I found you all. /par. /par. Dr. Hartwell, you don't have to choose between honoring Kayamika's grief and honoring her strategic resistance. She did both. She was both. And reducing her to only a victim or only a superhero either one is the mistake, /par. /par. She was a woman who experienced devastating trauma and who used that trauma as motivation to fight back in every way she could. Her grief was real and her resistance was real. Both deserve to be acknowledged, /par. /par. Grace, /par. /par. Vanessa included this letter in the third edition of her book, along with a new introduction addressing Dr. Johnson's critique, /par. /par. I am grateful to Dr. Johnson for raising important questions about how we honor our ancestors. He is right to warn against minimizing genuine suffering in our eagerness to find resistance and heroism, /par. /par. Kayamika's grief was real. 7 children stolen from her arms. 25 years of searching. Nights spent mourning and calling their names. That trauma was devastating and authentic, and nothing I've written should minimize it, /par. /par. But Kayamika herself according to testimony from her son insisted that her grief and her resistance were not separate things. Her grief motivated her resistance. Her resistance gave purpose to her grief. She was both a suffering mother and a strategic fighter, and both identities were authentic, /par. /par. This is the complexity of resistance within oppressive systems. People suffer genuine trauma and also find ways to fight back using that very trauma as a tool. Acknowledging the strategy doesn't diminish the suffering. Acknowledging the suffering doesn't diminish the strategy, /par. /par. Kayamika was underestimated by slaveholders who thought her singing was just the meaningless wailing of a grief-stricken woman. They dismissed her as a problem to be solved by selling her away. They never understood that her grief made her powerful, that her voice carried information, that every time they sold her they were moving her to a new location where she could gather more intelligence and teach more people, /par. /par. That's the bizarre secret no master could bear to keep after a single night, not that Kayamika was broken by grief, but that her grief made her dangerous. Her mourning confronted them with the horror of what slavery did to families. Her voice carried truths they couldn't control. Her humanity was too undeniable to keep in their presence, /par. /par. So they sold her away, over and over, thinking they were getting rid of a problem. But they were actually facilitating a resistance network that would help dozens of people escape and that would eventually reunite all 7 of Kayamika's children, /par. /par. That's not romanticizing. That's acknowledging the full truth. Suffering and resistance coexisted in the same person, in the same voice, in the same songs. And both deserve to be honored. /par. /par. The debate continued, but it was a productive debate that pushed historians to think more carefully about how to honor both the trauma and the agency of enslaved people acknowledging suffering without reducing people to victims, acknowledging resistance without romanticizing the horror they endured, /par. /par. In 2027, on the 180th anniversary of Kayamika being sold for the first time, the beginning of her 5 years being sold repeatedly, a memorial was established in Philadelphia near where she'd lived after escaping to freedom. The memorial was designed to honor both her grief and her resistance, /par. /par. The centerpiece was a sculpture of Kayamika standing with her arms outstretched, her mouth open in song. Around the base were inscribed the names of her 7 children in both English and Igbo: Adana, Kayamika, the younger, Chidi, Obim, Kambili, Amara, and Ifeoma, /par. /par. The inscription read, /par. /par. Kayamika, called Silence, /par. Circa 1813-1889 /par. /par. Mother of 7 children, all sold away between 1838-1845, /par. Sold at auction 23 times between 1847-1852 /par. Because no master could bear her nightly singing, /par. /par. They heard mourning. They heard disturbance. They heard grief, ****/par. They were right /im she was mourning, and her grief was profound, /par. /par. But she was also singing intelligence, /par. Teaching resistance, building networks, /par. Calling her children's names across distances, /par. Maintaining traditions, preserving language, /par. Using her voice as a weapon, /par. /par. For 25 years she sang every night, /par. Mourning her children and fighting for freedom, /par. Until she escaped in 1853, /par. And reunited with all 7 between 1854-1872, /par. /par. Her bizarre secret was this */par. Her grief made her too powerful to control, /par. Her voice carried truths that slaveholders couldn't silence, /par. Her humanity was too confrontational to bear, /par. /par. So they sold her away, over and over, /par. Thinking they were solving a problem, /par. They were actually facilitating resistance, /par. /par. She was never silent, /par. Her voice carried across distance and time, /par. Connecting her children, helping others escape, /par. Preserving culture, building networks, /par. /par. She survived. She fought. She won, ****/par. All 7 children found, /par. All 7 reunited, /par. The voice they tried to silence, /par. Echoes still. /par. /par. At the memorial dedication, Vanessa stood before a crowd of over 200 people /im descendants of Kayamika from all 7 of her children's lines, historians, activists, and community members, /par. /par. My ancestor Kayamika was sold 23 times because her grief was too powerful for slaveholders to bear, Vanessa began. For over a century, this was treated as evidence of mental illness or instability. But we now understand that Kayamika was using her voice as a weapon /im mourning her children while simultaneously building an intelligence network that helped others escape and that maintained connections across hundreds of miles, /par. /par. The bizarre secret that no master could keep after a single night wasn't a flaw. It was her strength. Her grief confronted slaveholders with the horror of what they were doing. Her singing carried information they couldn't control. Her humanity was too undeniable to keep in their presence, /par. /par. Kayamika's story teaches us that resistance takes many forms. Sometimes it's dramatic and violent. Sometimes it's quiet and strategic. Sometimes it's hidden in the very thing oppressors expect, /im the grief of a mother mourning her stolen children, /par. /par. And Kayamika's story teaches us that we don't have to choose between honoring suffering and honoring resistance. She was both a grieving mother and a strategic fighter. Her trauma was real. Her agency was real. Both deserve to be acknowledged and honored. /par. /par. Most importantly, Kayamika's story proves that some voices cannot be silenced. Slaveholders sold her away over and over, trying to eliminate the uncomfortable truth her singing carried. But her voice persisted. It echoed across plantations and years and separation. It connected her to her children until all 7 were found. And it echoes still, in the stories we tell, in the songs we remember, in the resistance we honor. /par. /par. The woman they called Silence was never silent. And we will make sure her voice is never forgotten. /par. /par. The memorial dedication concluded with a performance /m- a choir singing reconstructed versions of Kayamika's songs based on Dr. Okonkwo's research and traditional Igbo mourning music. The songs were haunting, beautiful, sorrowful, and powerful all at once. /par. /par. As Vanessa listened, surrounded by descendants of the woman who'd been her great-great-great-great-grandmother, she thought about the journey that had brought her here, from dismissive historians telling her the family's stories were exaggerated, through years of research uncovering the truth, to this moment of public acknowledgement and honor. /par. /par. She thought about Kayamika standing on auction blocks 23 times, being examined and sold like property, suffering the humiliation of ownership. She thought about Kayamika singing every night for 25 years, mourning her children while using that mourning as cover for resistance. /par. /par. And she thought about the final reunion in 1872, when Chitty /m- the 7th child, lost for 27 years /m- heard his mother's voice singing his name and knew he'd found her. /par. /par. That reunion was possible because Kayamika never stopped singing. Never let herself be truly silenced. Never gave up the search or the fight. /par. /par. The bizarre secret of the silent slave no master could bear to keep after a single night had been fully revealed. And the truth was more powerful, more complex, and more inspiring than anyone had imagined. /par. /par. Kayamika had been underestimated. She'd been dismissed as a problem, as mentally ill, as impossible to manage. But she'd been using that dismissal as cover for sophisticated resistance that had helped dozens escape and that had reunited her with all 7 of her children. /par. /par. She'd survived. She'd fought. She'd won. /par. /par. And her descendants /m- including Vanessa /m- would make sure that her voice echoed forever, carrying the message that some truths cannot be silenced, some grief cannot be controlled, and some people are too powerful in their humanity to be kept in chains. /par. /par. The woman called Silence had spoken across centuries. And finally, the world was listening. /par. /par.